Bill 96 is Quebec's legislation, which aims to make French the primary language of the province. Bill 96 would also declare Quebec a nation, a move that would require opening up the Constitution. What could possibly go wrong? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished TV. I'm Ed Hand. We're coming to you from a remote location and practicing physical distancing to enhance safety. Premier François Legault says the main reason for the need is the declining use of French in the province. Supporters of Bill 96 see it as essential because there is so much English in North America drowning out French and Quebec culture. On the other side of the coin is minority rights, as anglophones in Quebec will start to feel targeted. What has many concerned is Quebec's plan to use the Notwithstanding clause to get what it wants. Constitutional law experts are at odds whether Quebec can unilaterally change the Constitution, which further muddies the water. Now, our Unpublished.vote question asks, do you feel Bill 96 will violate the Constitution? And overwhelmingly, our viewers and listeners said yes. 91.3 agreed with that. 5.5 said no. 3.3 were unsure. Now, however you're watching and listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or our podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you, you can still cast your vote on this topic at unpublished.vote and then email your MP to tell them why. Now, joining us to discuss Bill 96, Peter Bureau is a lawyer and a founder of Section 1. Warren Kinsella is a columnist and a former advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, as well. Marion Sandeland is a lawyer with Conway Litigation and with the Quebec Community Group Network. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. Now, this starts basically with the claim that the French language is dying and needs protection. And Peter, do you agree with that or no? Well,
I don't know whether I agree with it. I think that is a bit of a red herring, the whole issue. There's competing social science data on that question. Some of it, and there's certainly competing anecdotal information on that question. At the end of the day, I don't think this is really about whether the French language is at risk at this moment. I think this is more about, if you're going to be sort of somewhat idealistic about it, it's about, Quebec's ability to define itself, to receive the kind of recognition from the rest of the country that it has long sought and never been granted. Marion will probably be in a better position than I to comment on the extent to which there's actually a risk at this point. Now, there's a lot of people, who feel that but for Bill 101, the infamous French language law going way back, but for Bill 101, French really would have been in serious jeopardy, and that Bill 101 not only preserved French as the dominant language of the province, but also, ironically, preserved the Federation. That is, that it prevented, separatism from really gaining more momentum than it did at the time. But I'm sure we'll have a chance to come back to that.
Well, what do you think, Warren? Do you think the French language is dying or in decline in Quebec?
No, I don't. And any of the data I've seen, Peter's quite right. It depends how you define these things, of course, and depends what data you look at. But what I've seen, it suggests that is not the case, number one. And number two, economically, Quebec has been doing far better than most of the other Canadian provinces. So they're, I don't think they're in bad shape at all. And I say that as somebody who was born in Montreal. I think really the reason why this is happening at this time is we have a weak prime minister and a minority parliament in the middle of a pandemic. And Legault is very popular in Quebec and is a shrewd politician, and he's calculated that a potential opponent in the form of Trudeau is weak. The English Canada is distracted in a way that it wasn't in 89 and 90 with Meach and also with Charlottetown later on. And what better time to do this and what better target to have than Justin Trudeau? So I believe that's why it's happening at this time.
Marion, the French language, is it in decline in Quebec? You're there.
Thanks. Well, I'm a lawyer, not a social scientist, so I don't comment on the social fact of whether or not French is in decline in Quebec. But what I will say is that right now, and over the past 6 months to a year, but particularly right now, people really believe that it is. And perhaps that's more important right now as a political fact.
Good point. Good point. Now, Warren, in one of your columns, you said this puts, if this opens up the Constitution, it puts Quebec above other provinces. How so?
Well, it makes makes some provinces more equal than others. So it's according nation status to itself. And what's now to stop Alberta from doing likewise? Jason Kenney's indicated now that he's going to do that. And it's as Peter pointed out in his piece on CBC's website, it's the unilateralism of it that's dangerous. This has been done in the past with respect, for example, to denominational schools in Newfoundland and Labrador, but that was done with a popular consensus. I mean, even in the case of Meech, there was an attempt at least to get elite consensus. Charlottetown, there was a bit of an attempt to reach out for populist consensus. I guess my question would be, guys, what the hell is the rush? If you're so convinced that this is the right and proper and ethical thing to do, well, then why don't you put it to the people and ask them what they think at a time when they're not preoccupied with the health of their family and their friends and their businesses and so on? Why the rush? Why do it now? Why not do it when they're paying attention to it? And then you have the benefit of the support of the people. But they're not doing that. I think we all know the reason why. They know that they wouldn't have the support of the people.
Marty, hop in, Peter. What was that, Peter?
Sorry for interrupting there.
No problem.
I was just asking Warren, which people does Warren think the Quebec government would not gain the support of? Is he talking about Quebec, or is he talking about the country as a whole?
Country as a whole.
Oh,
yeah. I mean, it's based upon, the experience with Meech. So Meech was an elite agreement amongst premiers, no question, but it fell, as we all know, because they failed to secure the support of the people. Charlottetown, they realized their mistake. They made an attempt at that, but the people defended it. And it was a much more moderate attempt at constitutional change than what's contemplated now. Legault is doing this now because he knows he can get away with it.
Well, can I just, I agree with a lot of what Warren said. I think the only thing I disagree with, and it's not really vital a point, but is on the rationale for doing it now. I mean, I really think you're absolutely right. There's a weak prime minister. There's no federal leadership at all, and not just from the prime minister, but from the leaders of any of the national parties in Ottawa. They've all capitulated here. They are all, to borrow Pierre Trudeau's famous phrase, head waiters to the provinces, or at least to Quebec in this particular case. But I do think the reason is that Legault is strong right now, and it's an opportunity, I think, to completely occupy the field, if you will, of nationalism and to sideline Québec solidaire, to completely wipe out the Parti québécois. We need to remember that successive Quebec governments, governing parties, starting with the Liberals in 1971 under Bourassa, and we remember the Victoria Conference and Victoria Charter, again with Bourassa, and then of course with René Lévesque as premier, and then again with Bourassa, both during Meech and then Charlottetown. We have Quebec governing parties that consistently reflect a will on the part of the Quebec, at least Francophone population, to express itself nationally, to have that expression acknowledged, recognized, entrenched in the Constitution. And so I don't think that's unimportant. I think that the timing, we can be cynical about the timing, and I don't think you're completely wrong about that, Warren. But at the end of the day, it's an issue that's going to continue to come back. And that's why I don't even think the question sociologically of whether French is particularly at risk at this particular moment is really the critical question. I mean, this is an issue that's going to continue to come back. And, back in 87, I was standing strong with Deborah Coyne and Clyde Wells, who of course were proxies for Pierre Trudeau. I think I've modified my own position, since then, I have to say. If I was holding the same view I did then, I'd just be categorically against this. I've moderated my views on it, although and you mentioned my column, Warren. It's clear, I wouldn't agree to anything unless the notwithstanding clause were put on the table for repeal. And of course, I'm not naive about the prospect of success of that move, but I think, the moment is crying out for leadership right now. So we may as well talk about big and difficult questions, put them all on the table at the same time. So Bill 96, without a notwithstanding clause, would be something very, very different from a principled standpoint for me.
Marion, the notwithstanding clause that we have been talking about, could this ever survive? Do you think this would ever pass without the notwithstanding clause?
I think the National Assembly could put it through without they could simply take it out. They could take those parts out of the bill. Right. The rest of the bill would be what it is. And I think there are a number of constitutional problems with the bill. And it would now be subject to scrutiny under all these new constitutional provisions that were being shielded from the notwithstanding clause. I just want to go back to the constitutional amendment, say a few things about that. I attended a very interesting session with some Francophone constitutional scholars hosted at Université Laval about a week after the bill was tabled. And the consensus among that group was that this amendment does achieve more than what was achieved with Meech and Charlottetown, and does so unilaterally, and that it's a sign of maturity on Quebec's part to do this. But there isn't the same popular movement around the issues as there was perhaps in the 80s. That's what they said. This idea that there's a part of the Constitution Act of 1867 that belongs to Quebec, that's Quebec's part of the Constitution, is a new idea that was introduced through Bill 96. And we hear this repeated now a lot. It's a new idea that comes from Bill 96. The idea of a nation, recall that the amendment says Quebecers form a nation, and then it says the common language, the official language of Quebec is French. There's a distinction between Quebecers and Quebec. And I think the meaning of that has not been probed at all yet. And it introduces this new idea of a nation that may or may not be coextensive with the province of Quebec. There's a lot of discussion of the constitutional amendment, which is important. But what I see less of is a discussion of what else is in this bill. This bill is 100 pages long. What else is in this bill that isn't being talked about? And finally, the notwithstanding clause, just to say that this is by far the most sweeping use of human rights overrides ever in Canadian history.
Wow.
And I question, we need to think much more carefully about what is the relationship between the constitutional amendment and this use of the notwithstanding clause.
I think a lot of people are wondering about, we talk about opening up the Constitution, but then hearing that each province has its own Constitution. And from what I'm getting from you, Marion, is that's not necessarily the case?
There's an idea that each province has its own Constitution, and it has to do with how the legislature and executive are set up. For example, Quebec used to have an upper house and a lower house, and it abolished its upper house. That's part of the Constitution of Quebec. This idea that there's a part of the Constitution Act 1867, which is our foundational constitutional document. The idea that there's parts of that document that belong to provinces, that's a new idea.
Different. I didn't realize that. We talk about languages as well, but let's talk about Indigenous languages. Where does that leave, First Nations, Indigenous people in Quebec? Marion?
First Nations and Métis and Inuit have constitutional recognition under a different part of the Constitution, which, as far as I understand, should remain unaffected by this. This amendment introduces a new idea, a new nation into the Constitution, which is the nation of Quebecers. So that's the new idea. And I would be very interested to hear from Indigenous constitutional scholars what effect they think this will have on the relationship with Indigenous nations.
Warren, Quebec wants to declare itself a nation. How is this different from what Stephen Harper declared in 2006?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, there was a declaration there. He lost Michael Chong as part of his cabinet when he did so. And Peter's quite right. There's just, it's the weakest group of federal leaders I think I've seen in my lifetime. So there's unanimity on this thing. And that's one of the reasons why it's moving through. But, we need to, in my opinion, give an opportunity for people to pronounce themselves on it. As Marion says, this is our supreme legal document. This is, the constitutional center of our country. You don't insert interpretive clauses in the Constitution without first having the opportunity to review what they might mean and what the significance would be. I mean, back with Meech, the reason why I left my legal practice in Ottawa, where I was perfectly happy and went to work for the Jean Chrétien guy, is when, Mulroney and some of the premiers said that referring distinct society and the Declaration of Nationhood for Quebec to the Supreme Court of Canada to see what it would mean, to do that thing that provinces and federal governments can do, get a reference, get the highest court to review what it would mean and the implications of it. They refused to do so. And they said that it would be un-Canadian. And at that point I said, well, the hell with this. I'm going to find a politician who I can support. And that was Jean Chrétien, and he was aided to some degree by Elijah Harper and Clyde Wells and others. The problem now is we just don't have that. I think you've got some of the people who have written on this subject. Mm-hmm. Eddie Goldenberg, who used to also work for Mr. Chrétien, has written on it. But it's the silence has been deafening, and it's really depressing because this is as important as it gets. The people need an opportunity to take a look at this, and certainly I think the High Court, we'd benefit from that, but none of those things are happening. It's moving through, and it feels like the country is changing under our feet without anybody particularly paying attention to it.
One part of the Bill 96 as well, Peter, is regarding CJAPs and only allowing a small percentage of French students to go and learn to learn in English. And I'm wondering, how is that going to help the French language?
Well, again, you got to go back to the history of Bill 101 and to the exceptions that were carved in at different times for minority language education and for English. My view first of all, I don't think it will. Help the French language all that much. But, my view, and I want to say I agree with everything that Warren just said about the lack of any kind of national response to this, critically important proposal to change a document that is our, is our constitutional document. What I would say is, and this has certainly been my position, is that this cannot happen unilaterally. So the fact that you've got a province that is purporting to act unilaterally doesn't make it so. And with the exception of a couple of scholars, Benoit Pelletier is one of them, most of the constitutional scholars that I have been paying attention to, and certainly my own reading of the Constitution, would suggest that this cannot occur unilaterally. In a worst case scenario, it requires Parliament, meaning the House of Commons and the Senate. More likely, it requires the 750 formula, and now post Charlottetown, probably by convention also requires a consultative referendum. There's some debate about whether that's the case. You'll remember that it was the consultative referendum that sunk Charlottetown at the end of the day. There was unanimity amongst the premiers. But in any case, in terms of education, I'm very mindful, I've always been an advocate for minority rights, whether they're minority language rights, religious rights, rights of expression, etc. I think that this is a case where a compromise is doable while still preserving Quebec as what I call a liberal constitutional democracy. I mean, one can think of all kinds of countries around the world where, there is an official language and where there are minorities that are unfortunately required to live under the official language of the country. And there's still, constitutions with robust, civil liberties and human rights protections. Marion was answering your question about, where does this leave the Indigenous population, Aboriginal, First Nations, Canadians? I don't think that it changes anything for them, which I think is what Marion was agreeing with. I don't think that this has an impact on their standing, on their position, and on their rights, such as they are. As we know, Canada is now embarking on yet a new chapter in its relationship with First Nations, and it's going to be quite a dramatic and consequential one, I think. And it may well be where all of the national attention and oxygen is sort of directed at this time. But that doesn't make the Bill 96 any less critical of an issue requiring national attention.
Marion, I wanted to talk to you about the impact of Bill 96 on the courts and the court system. From what I understand, that you won't be getting in both languages; it'll just be in French now. Is that the case?
It's not quite the case. There's a constitutional right in Quebec to use English or French in the courts in Quebec. That's guaranteed at Section 133 of the Constitution Act 1867. That isn't supposed to change, that constitutional right. However, and this has been going back and forth, Bill 101, the original version of Bill 101 included some provisions that were later struck down because they didn't provide that right to use English and French. So this has been a kind of cat and mouse over the years since Bill 101 was passed. So there are new provisions now that kind of skate close to that right, I would say. For example, any legal person, so a corporation who wants to file a document in court in Quebec, up till now they've had the right to do so in English or French. Now, Bill 96 adds a requirement to file a French translation of your pleadings at the same time as you file your English pleadings. So that's quite a change. That means you can't really use English or French. You have to use English and French. That's different. There's a new requirement for any judgments rendered in English to be translated and immediately attach a French translation to them. That would be at the court's expense, but it's likely to cause delays in getting those judgments issued if they have to go through translation first, whereas the French judgments don't have to go through translation. So there's a few things like that in Bill 96 that seem to eat away at the right to use English in courts. And the other really important one that needs to be talked about more is the idea that the Minister of Justice and the newly created Minister of the French language will now approve any requirement for a judge to have a knowledge of English. Up till now, it's been up to the superior courts to determine which judges they need to have to be able to speak English to fulfill the constitutional rights of the English-speaking community. And now there's going to be two ministers who are going to weigh in on those requirements. So to me, that also raises a question about judicial independence.
When we look at this situation, we're getting close to winding up here, folks, but every time I hear language and in this country, I always think of a national unity debate. And Maureen, we'll start with you. Is that where we're headed again?
I don't think so. I wish we were, in the sense that it's important that we, as I've mentioned, that people look at this. But no, I mean, the pandemic is understandably a pretty big story. It has fundamentally changed our lives politically and economically and socially and culturally. It's the biggest story of our lifetimes. And like I said at the start, I think that's why this is being brought forward at this time. We're distracted and we're paying attention to something else. And regrettably, the debate, apart from on this show, really hasn't been happening. And that's a sad thing for the country, because I think there's some aspects of this legislation, for example, the ability of them to go into somebody's personal cell phone at the office to see if they're using English or French, are just have, as Miriam says, terrible consequences for human rights and the rights of minorities in the province of Quebec. And it's just, nobody's paying attention to it. It's very sad.
Marion, obviously you're representing QCGN. There are some people talking about it, right?
Well, the QCGN is making a big push. It's really important for the public to understand what's in this bill. There's a lot in this bill that isn't being talked about. Warren just talked about one of the provisions that needs to get a lot more attention from there are a lot of provisions in this bill that people need to learn about, and the QCGN is making a big push in the next few weeks to inform the public about what's in the bill.
And what do you think, Peter? Are we up for another national unity debate, or will we avoid it?
No, unfortunately, there won't be one. I agree with Warren 100%. I think it's tragic for the country. The question is, though, what happens to the bill? What happens beyond this? I mean, obviously, there will be court challenges. I mean, if Quebec proceeds unilaterally and Ottawa does not stand up, I'm hopeful that some other provinces will bring applications to challenge the ability of Quebec to do anything unilaterally regarding the use of the French language. I'm not so troubled by the nation status issue. I'm not saying it's unimportant. It would be an interpretive provision in the Constitution. There are no words in a Constitution that are meaningless. They can't ever be treated as meaningless. It's fundamental principle, statutory and constitutional interpretation. But somebody's got to bring some challenges. It's just very unfortunate that it looks like the challenges will occur before the judiciary rather than in the public square and in the legislatures, of course, of all of the provinces and of Parliament. So no, we desperately need a national unity debate. I think there's an opportunity actually to bring Quebec into the fold with dignity, but while at the same time using this as an opportunity to push back against those aspects of the legislation that are truly objectionable, or as Marion's pointed out, that clearly would infringe fundamental rights and freedoms under the Charter. But there are constitutional scholars who say that the bill in its present form actually doesn't require Section 33. I'm not completely certain of it.
Well, folks,
unfortunately, there won't be a national unity debate. And that is a complete failure of leadership in Ottawa.
I want to thank our guests on this edition of Unpublished TV. Peter Bureau is a lawyer and the founder of Section 1. Warren Kinsellas, columnist, advisor to former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. And Marion Sandeland is a lawyer for the Quebec Community Groups Network. And I want to thank you for watching Unpublished TV. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.